Okay, great. I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to share the virtual dice, especially with Jim, who I was remembering last night. I met, I think, 3 years ago when I basically cold called him and said, I'm going to be on your campus at Hawaii Manoa. Can we get a cup of coffee and let me pick your brain a little bit about humor studies? He demonstrated his amiability then and has continued to ever since. So thanks for that, Jim. So today, the remarks I'm going to give derive from my current book project, which is called Savage Laughter, 19th Century American Humor in the Pacific. In the book, I try to show how popular comic materials like cannibal jokes, comic almanacs, cartoons, parodic exhibits, Mark Twain's lectures on Hawaii helped shape the American imagination of the Pacific Islands and the Pacific Islanders, often in ways, of course, that encouraged or celebrated American imperialism. But in the book, I also want to detail the subversive power of Pacific Islanders' comic resistance to imperialism. And I've been looking for ways to do that responsibly. So that's what we're talking about here today. As you might be able to tell from the abstract in the program, I'm actually doing something a little bit different here in this talk than I would normally do in a conference paper. So I'm going to begin with a synthesis of some recent scholarly conversations that I think will be useful to humor scholars working on issues of empire, sort of broadly conceived. Then I'm going to briefly describe and test out several of the possible methodologies that I hope might be applicable to all of our work, not just about the Pacific. So I'll start with September 2015. There was a special issue of American Quarterly, and that issue was called Pacific Currents, which sought to put into conversation the overlapping fields of American studies and Native Pacific studies. I think there's some lessons from the essays and the forums in that issue that are relevant to us as humor scholars, as we seek to conduct careful and conscientious scholarship on comedy and empire without replicating colonial and imperial erasures in our own work. And so in the first half of this, if it seems like I'm overquoting a bit, that's kind of on purpose. That's one of my conscious strategies in studying Native Pacific Islander humor is to read, quote, and give credit to indigenous scholars and scholars who grew up on the Pacific Islands. First, Greg Dvorak, who grew up in American Samoa, in his essay, Oceanizing Pacific Studies, complains of the bizarre mix of myopia, hubris, and apathy with which American discourses often presume to own and know the Pacific. He notes the field's long history of looking through colonial optics at indigenous subjects, marginalizing Native voices as background noise with no agency. He calls for scholars instead to think of articulations, not assimilations, acknowledging difference by seeing the contradictions and nuances that form cultural identity through intimate genealogies. Such appeals for intellectual complexity should motivate humor scholars like us to recover or reframe Native humor or that of other marginalized groups that we study in ways that highlight resiliency, agency, and cultural autonomy. Situating Native humor in conversations about contact demonstrates how humor and humor criticism can potentially, anyway, work as decolonial tactics. Indeed, in the issue's introduction, Paul Lyons and Taipi Kawika Tengan claim that critically engaging with the ship of American empire as it slowly comes about in new forms of gunboat diplomacy requires the scholars undertake, quote, decolonial, anti-colonial, and indigenizing approaches. Such approaches demand that we as humor scholars be self-critical about our motives and methods in order to avoid unconsciously practicing what Brandy Nalani McDougall calls colonial entitlement. She defines colonial entitlement as, quote, the naturalized authority / ownership over everyone and everything indigenous that emerges from histories of conquest. And I'm going to read part of this long quote here. McDougall warns that, quote, colonial entitlement goes largely unquestioned by its wielder. Just as American settler colonialism is a foreign introduction in Hawaii, yet asserts itself as normative, scholars who have no specialized expertise or obvious connection to indigeneity may assume a naturalized authority that, especially when accomplished by institutional and commercial support, i.e. funding and publishing opportunities, university teaching positions, national speaking engagements, and awards programs, renders them recognized experts. Simultaneously, indigenous expertise and specialized knowledge are often boldly dismissed, denied, and exploited. Academic gatekeeping ensures that the existence of indigenous knowledge and expertise remains obscured. At stake is the freedom and natural right for indigenous peoples to represent and speak for ourselves. So, okay, this raises some serious issues about how and when non-native scholars should even attempt to study comedy and empire. That is, if in our attempts to restore past native agency for someone like me who works in the 19th century, in our scholarship, if in doing that we silence and obscure current native voices, then we're doing more harm than good. McDougall points to how scholars who research, quote, indigenous histories, cultures, and issues using only English language sources can become unconsciously vulnerable to merely reproducing colonial misrepresentations and the structure of settler power that it reinforces. So obviously, we as humor scholars want to interrogate cultures of empire in order to do decolonial work, not to recolonize. So it behooves us, at the very least, to be aware of our own institutional privileges and biases as we work. Whereas McDougall focuses on the problems associated with relying on English translations of texts, Diana Lusser, in an essay on pre-colonial Pacific theater, laments the paucity of, quote, texts or source materials from that period that adequately represent indigenous viewpoints on this topic. Most of the extant records, she writes, are inevitably mediated by the perspectives of foreigners, often unfamiliar with language or culture of their hosts, and filtering their data through a variety of interpretive structures derived from their personal background. As written documents, Lusser surmises, such records inscribe their own forms of authority and erasure that in most cases operated in service of a broader colonial project. So for this reason, when we as humor scholars study Euro-American records of contact and empire, we must be sure to account for the narrators' epistemological biases and mercantile goals or imperial goals while seeking alternative possible explanations for the ambiguous moments of laughter that they describe. That is, note their descriptions, but doubt their interpretations and sometimes doubt their intentions. So one approach then is to read Anglo-authored texts describing comic encounters with, for instance, in my field, Pacific Islanders across the grain, identifying native agency where the authors might describe only their own confusion. Examining rhetoric like that to seek native Pacific Islanders' comic power is a useful corrective to accounts of the Pacific that, to go back to Dvorak, as he puts it, write off Pacific Islanders and Pacific places as the inevitable, sad, hapless victims or bulldozed landscapes of wars, colonialism, weapons testing, or sea level rise. I certainly do a fair bit of that in my book project, and that approach has been taken before, though not so much with humor. In fact, Paul Lyons, in his book American Pacificism, has claimed that, quote, Oceanian humor, so fundamental to island life, is one of the most telling casualties of Pacificist discourses. For him, Pacificism is sort of like Said's Orientalism. He reapplies that in a new context. Identifying Native Pacific Islanders' comic agency in these highly mediated texts while highlighting American and European misunderstandings of it can help to reframe power relations at moments of contact from unilateral domination to complex exchange. But, and there's going to be a lot of buts in this talk, right? Even such efforts might reflect and recursively reinforce unconscious ethnocentrism. Historian Noelani Arista points this out in her history of the relationship between Hawaii and the US throughout the 19th century. This is a fairly new book and it's quite good. She points out that even well-intentioned revisionist work's emphasis on restoring agency to Hawaiian historical actors carries another risk: the unreflective use of Western historiographical paradigms, tropes, and plots in telling histories of culturally other peoples. This is certainly a trap that we must be aware of, and we must seek to avoid when reading imperial narratives across the grain. So, okay, what else might those who study American humor and empire do to avoid repeating the ethnocentric and imperial impulses of some historiography? There's a few potential approaches here that I've talked about in other venues. I'm just going to talk about one today, and that's to reread Euro-American authored travel narratives with an eye for something slightly different than just looking for agency. And what I'm looking for here is moments wherein Western travelers write to express their appreciation of Pacific Islanders' humor and associate the risibility with intelligence, with agency, and with intercultural competency. So seeking moments of shared laughter, and when Western visitors appreciate Native Pacific Islanders' humor, this can destabilize prevailing histories of encounter, which, as Arista notes, quote, tend to emphasize fatal impacts, worlds colliding, with contention and conflict defining the interpretation of events. Instead, cultural histories might benefit from rereading encounters as, quote, confluence of worlds where the mixing of numerous languages, social practices, and ways of defining life works fluidly. Doing so, according to Arista, highlights what occurs when people from different meaning-making systems engage with one another. Moments of understanding and misunderstanding become constitutive of historical outcomes. So through shared laughter and appreciation of humor, members of both sides of an encounter, sometimes throughout especially the 18th and 19th centuries, express their intentions, but benign or otherwise, their mutual bewilderment, and the reciprocal realizations of the constructedness of their own epistemologies. Identifying such moments in Euro-American authored travel narratives can counter imperial accounts that frame contact as unilateral domination, even when they occur in texts that admittedly have the larger project of precisely such domination. So finding and analyzing passages in travel narratives wherein visitors express appreciation of the comic acuity of Pacific Islanders can reveal surprising undercurrents in these narratives that serve to undercut prevalent notions of cultural differences and inferiority that were often used to justify imperial and missionary projects. So let me briefly highlight two such moments in two different Anglo-authored travel narratives. The first comes from American sea captain Amasa Delano's 1818 narrative of voyages and travels. You might know the name Amasa Delano, Melville fans, wherein he praises Abba Thulle, the king in Palau, quote, as a most sportive and delightful companion. In doing so, Delano frames Abba Thulle's good humor as emblematic of effective leadership qualities. He writes, "He was distinguished for his pleasantry in the hours of relaxation in his house or among his friends, as he was terrible in the field, able in counsel, and sagacious in morals. Our officers and myself have often seen him, in the flow of good feeling and good nature, make amusement for himself, the women, and us, without the least offense to any individual." In this description, Delano suggests that intercultural amiability, to reuse a term from Jim's talk, based in part on humor, is key to creating diplomacy and maintaining fruitful relationships between Pacific Islanders and American sailors. In fact, the context of these remarks is Delano's second visit to Palau after initial contact in 1798. But for the purposes of the methodology I'm talking about here today, just as important as Abba Thulle's good humor is Delano's openness to it. Delano writes, "We had become so much acquainted with the language that we could enter into the spirit of his wit and humor, and were able to find new sources of admiration for his character and his moments of the greatest levity." Though, of course, and we have to admit that their exchange is multiply mediated through Delano's translation, as well as his own memory and his own self-betrayal, the fact that Delano locates his admiration for Abba Thulle's character in his moments of greatest levity shows the power of humor and laughter to connect across cultures. Even, of course, as we know, it can sometimes be used to reify cultural difference. So unlike his fictional namesake, who in Herman Melville's 1855 BENITO CERENO has an ethnocentrism so bad that it blinds him to the truth of a slave revolt, Delano in his 1818 narrative, the real Delano, learns Abba Thulle's language so that he may understand the spirit of his wit and humor more or less on its own terms. Familiarity with native language especially opens up potential understanding of linguistic aspects of humor, like wordplay, and the accompanying cultural norms encoded in that wordplay. A similar willingness to learn and appreciate Pacific Islanders' linguistic humor is apparent in Reverend John Williams' 1837 narrative of missionary enterprises in the South Sea Islands. I may be cheating a little bit here because Williams himself was British and his book was originally published in London. But his narrative was very, very popular in the US. And in fact, a humorous anecdote from that narrative that was told, quote, as an example of their wit and humor, was likely quite familiar to American audiences, having been reprinted at least 31 times in newspapers, magazines, and jest books that I found between 1838 and 1879. So it had a long run in circulation. If in the after session you want me to tell you that joke, and talk about the reprints, is kind of fascinating. And that's another area of my study is reprints. So I'm happy to do that if you want later on. In praising Pacific Islanders' senses of humor, he singles out wordplay. Of the pun, they are very fond and use it frequently. I could give numerous examples of this, but the point of such witticisms is so much blunted by translation that I think I should not do their authors justice by presenting them to the English reader. Wayne's point about Pacific Islanders' humor being so much blunted by translation parallels McDougall's lament about misguided studies of translations of the Hawaiian creation chant the Kumulipo. And this is McDougall again. She writes, translations are never exact linguistic, cultural, or transnational transactions, though they simulate exactness. As translations are often the only means through which non-speakers may interact with Hawaiian language texts, the biases within English translations of Hawaiian literature and analysis can be invisible to readers unfamiliar with Hawaii's colonial history and politics. For similar reasons, it seems, Williams declines to even attempt translation of the puns he so values. Instead, he assures his readers that Pacific Islanders' wordplay is evidence of their cleverness and intelligence. In doing so, Williams questions not only stereotypes about Pacific Islanders' alleged inferiority to Europeans, but also the criteria by which such stereotypes are created. And this is a long sort of musing that Williams has that I won't read to save us time. But basically, he praises wit as one of the ingredients of Pacific Islanders' capabilities. It's only one of the ingredients, but the fact that this evaluation appears in a section of his narrative that's titled Polynesian Wit and Humor, Their Proverbs, Their Good Sense. That shows just how connected Polynesian wit and humor was, for Williams anyway, with their good sense. Just as important, like Delano, Williams was willing, again, if we trust his self-reporting, to put in cultural and linguistic work, to put in the work to learn to appreciate those qualities. As a missionary, of course, Williams's ultimate goal was not so much to understand and celebrate Pacific cultures as it was to convert Pacific Islanders to Christianity. But in spite of, or maybe even, I can't figure it out, maybe even due to his professional or religious directive, Williams's narrative exhibits a surprising cognizance of cultural relativity in the sort of comparative ethnography that he undertakes. Here's one moment of that. It is a remarkable fact that almost every race thinks itself the wisest. While in the pride of mental superiority, civilized nations look upon barbarous tribes as almost destitute of intellect, these cherish the same sentiments towards them. And even Britons have not been exempted from degrading representations. With South Sea Islanders, it is common to say, when they see a person very exceedingly awkward, how stupid you are. Perhaps you are an Englishman. That's my favorite line in this whole talk. Though Euro-American travel narratives tend to commodify and exoticize Pacific Islands and their inhabitants, these moments featuring native Pacific Islanders' laughter seem to waver, if only momentarily, in their ethnocentrism as they at least partially force the readers of these narratives to see themselves from the Islanders' point of view. Whether the writers or their compatriots or the readers get the joke or not, realizing that they are its butt forces them to recognize, if not fully authorize, the existence of a competing epistemology. Williams's willingness to record an Islander's comic insult about his countrymen and to use it as an example of all people's ethnocentrism displays both his and the South Sea Islanders' relative recognition of both the complexities of cultural contact and the usefulness of shared laughter in demystifying it. Kim Leilani Evans, in her essay on the mutual laughter of contact, which is mostly an essay on Melville, claims that laughing with a stranger over strangeness is a legitimate interaction, where the connection is awkward, mutual, misconnection that serves a purpose. So we should look not just for recorded moments when Pacific Islanders laugh at white visitors, and I do plenty of that in my book project, but also when they laugh with them. Laughing at the sheer ridiculousness of contact tends to make us more open to alternate epistemologies and more skeptical of surety in our own ways of knowing. This is what, to a certain extent, both Delano and Williams express in their narratives. When the joke that cultural norms are just norms and entirely variable is understood by both parties, it becomes shared and can relieve the tension of contact. The laugh here is not or not just at the other. It is at the other's norms, one's own norms, and the very fact of being committed to any norms at all. Shared laughter, even if that laughter is at the impossibility of clear communication, clears the way for understanding and exchange. But let me end with a blunt admission that this approach has its potential pitfalls as well. First, if we're not careful and highlighting moments of comic communication and mutual respect in travel narratives, we might accidentally or naively elide these travel narratives' overarching imperial, mercantile, religious, scientific, and or self-promoting purposes. In other words, because we only have one side of the story, we might falsely celebrate figures like Delano and Williams as the good guys, thus occluding or excusing systems of domination and exploitation that structured and, probably just as important, funded their travel and framed their subsequent descriptions of it. Second, it might simply be too optimistic to assume that comic cooperation necessarily leads to equal cultural exchange and positive outcomes. After all, I have to be if I'm historicizing, I have to admit that it did not turn out that well for Williams. This is Williams's death. In 1839, he visited part of the BENITO Islands where he was unknown, and he was killed and allegedly devoured by the natives there. So to quote a circulating cannibal joke from later on in the century, that missionary was certainly a good fellow. So there's caveats to the approach I've demonstrated today, but I do hope that I've shown at least some of the possibilities of a heuristic for reading Euro-American authored, otherwise empire-building narratives for just moments of mutual admiration and fruitful communication based in part on comic exchange. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.